The morning Saren Ashfield carried a wounded fox through the center of Ironvale. Nobody moved out of her way. That was not unusual. People rarely moved for Saren. She was small, quiet, and ranked at the bottom of a social structure that had very clear opinions about what the bottom was worth. She walked carefully, holding the fox against her chest with both arms, feeling its shallow breathing against her hands. Its back leg had been caught in a wire trap near the forest border, and she had found it just before dawn, shivering in the cold grass, its amber eyes wide with a fear it could not name, and she could not explain away. She had no tools with her when she found it. She had been out walking, as she often was before the settlement woke up, moving along the edge of the deep forest, where the pine trees pressed so close together that the world beyond them felt like a different country entirely. She walked there because it was the only hour when Ironvale felt like it belonged to her. Before the market opened, before the children ran through the lanes, before the Alpha King's patrol changed shifts with the sound of heavy boots on stone and the low, authoritative voices of men who had been told, all their lives, that they were the ones who mattered. She had used her scarf to wrap the fox's leg. It was the only fabric she had on her. She walked the full 2 kilometers back to the settlement, with her neck bare in the autumn cold, focusing on the animal's warmth against her chest, rather than her own discomfort. By the time she entered the main lane, her fingers were stiff. The first person who saw her was Greta Linwood, who ran the bread stall, and who had, on 3 separate occasions, referred to Saren in public as that strange Omega woman who talks to animals, as if this were a verdict rather than a description. Her expression was the particular kind of blank that people wear when they are deciding not to acknowledge something inconvenient. The 2 women did not make eye contact. Saren kept walking. She turned down the narrow side path that led to her cottage at the settlement's northern edge. The cottage was stone, 2 rooms, with a low ceiling, and a garden at the back that most people would have described as chaotic. Saren would have described it as intentional, because it was. The tall grass along the back fence was left for the hedgehogs. The pile of branches near the stone wall was deliberate shelter for beetles. The muddy patch near the garden gate had been maintained carefully for a family of toads that had lived there for 6 years running. The garden looked like neglect to people who did not know what they were looking at. Saren knew exactly what she was looking at, every square meter of it. She set the fox on her work table and unwrapped the scarf with careful hands. The wound was not deep, but infection had already crept in during the night hours, and the animal's temperature was elevated. She worked quickly and cleanly, using the proper supplies she kept stocked in the cabinet above the table, speaking in a low and even voice the entire time, not commanding, not soothing in an exaggerated way, simply present, simply there. The fox, which had been trembling when she first laid it down, grew still within the first few minutes. It watched her with those amber eyes, and whatever it found in her face seemed to satisfy some calculation running beneath its instincts. This was the thing about Saren, that the village had largely decided not to examine too closely. Animals behaved differently around her, not in a dramatic or theatrical way, not in the way of stories where creatures bow down or perform, simply in the quieter, stranger way of a fact that had no comfortable explanation, so most people had filed it under things that don't need to be thought about, and moved on with their days. She had grown up in Ironvale, in this same cottage, under the care of her grandmother, Elara Ashfield. Her parents had left when she was 4, a story she had long since stopped telling, partly because it had no satisfying shape, and partly because Elara had been more than enough. Her grandmother had been a permanent fixture in the settlement, known throughout as the person you brought an injured or sick animal to when the situation was beyond the ordinary. Elara had not been celebrated for this. She had been used for it. She had not complained. She had simply done the work, year after year, in this same kitchen, at this same table. Saren had grown up watching, had grown up learning the difference between a frightened animal and a dangerous one, between the silence of a creature at ease and the silence of a creature calculating its options. She had learned to read the angle of ears, the weight distribution in a body when something changed in the air, the particular quality of stillness that came right before movement. Her grandmother had never taught these things as lessons. They were absorbed the way children absorb language, through proximity and repetition, and the simple fact of paying attention to something long enough that it begins to make sense on its own terms. The cottage still smelled like Elara, dried herbs and wood smoke, and something underneath those 2 things that Saren could never quite name. She kept the kitchen almost exactly as it had been left 11 years ago when her grandmother passed. She had added a second work table over time, and better tools, and a bookshelf that was slowly bending under the weight of animal reference texts and specialty journals she ordered twice a year from the settlement's book trader. But the bones of the space were Ilara's. Saren was comfortable with that. It felt less like living in the past, and more like living in something that had already proven itself. Outside, Ironvale had been waking up for the past 2 hours. She could hear it through the thick stone walls. The settlement was not large, perhaps 400 people in total, arranged in social rings that everyone understood without being formally taught them. The rings had an architecture that was felt rather than seen. Everyone knew their position. Everyone knew who stood above them and who stood below. The system had enough exceptions and variations to feel, from the inside, like something organic rather than something constructed. But it was constructed, carefully and deliberately, by generations of alpha leadership that had found the arrangement useful. At the center of those rings, in the largest building on the main square, lived Alpha King Kalen Duskmore. She had been a child the first time she saw him. He had come through the market with his father, who had been the Alpha King before him. Kalen had been 16 or 17 then, still growing into the particular quality he now wore as naturally as his own skin, the quality of someone who has never once had to wonder whether they belong in a room. He was tall, with dark hair, and eyes that were cold in a way his admirers read as focused, and his detractors read as something else entirely. He had moved through the market without looking at anything very long, and the people around him had adjusted their body positions unconsciously, making small tilts and angles of deference as he passed, the way plants unconsciously bend toward light. Saren had been standing at her grandmother's side with a basket of supplies. Ilara had not adjusted her body. Ilara never adjusted for anyone, which was one of many things about her grandmother that Saren had filed under things I am still working to understand. She was 28 now. She had never spoken directly to the Alpha King, and their social positions created no occasions that would require it. She saw him at the mandatory public gatherings. She saw his patrol units walk past her gate each morning at 6, a predictable rhythm she had learned to time her garden work around. She knew his reputation through the accumulated information that circulates in any settlement small enough for everything to be known. He was fair in the specific way that powerful men are sometimes fair, meaning, when it cost him nothing. He was unforgiving when he felt his authority was being questioned. He had a gift for public humiliation that he used rarely enough that people rarely expected it, which made it more effective when it came. The fox slept on her work table by mid-morning. Its breathing settled into a smooth rhythm. Saren sat at the kitchen table with tea and one of Ilara's older journals, the one from the year Saren was born. The handwriting was small and controlled, the writing of someone who had spent decades learning not to waste space on the page. She was reading an entry about the ancient wolves, not the ordinary forest wolves that moved through Ironvale's territory seasonally. Those were managed, or attempted to be managed, by the pack's patrol teams, using deterrence and established containment routines. They were known quantities. They had behavioral patterns that, once understood, were reasonably predictable. The ancient wolves were different. The difference was not easily described in factual terms, which was perhaps why they appeared in official pack records only obliquely, in footnotes, in marginal notes, in the careful hedging of report writers who were not sure how to categorize what they had seen. They were larger than ordinary wolves, noticeably so. They moved differently. They did not respond to the deterrence that worked reliably on ordinary forest animals. They appeared to operate by rules that no one in the settlement had ever successfully mapped. Ilara had known them. That was the quiet fact at the center of everything Saren understood about her grandmother's life. Ilara had known the ancient wolves the way a person knows a long-standing neighbor, through accumulated time, through patience, through a mutual understanding, built so slowly and carefully that by the time it was established, it had the solidity of something that had always been there. She had not dominated them. She had not managed them. She had been consistent and honest and present across many years, and they had decided, in their own time, that she was worth knowing. The journal entry Saren was reading had been written on an autumn morning in the year Saren was 2 months old. Ilara had written, "Went to the north border at first light. The silver one came out of the tree line and stood at about 40 meters. I sat down on the cold ground and waited. She came to 30 meters, then 20, then she sat too. We stayed like that for a while. My granddaughter was in the cottage. I could hear her breathing from here." Saren read those last 2 lines 3 times. She set the journal down on the table and looked at the fox sleeping quietly on her work table. Then she looked at the north-facing window, through which, if she stood close enough to the glass, she could see the dark, unbroken line of the deep forest against the pale autumn sky. She poured a second cup of tea and sat with it. In 2 weeks, the annual pack gathering was scheduled. It was mandatory for all settlement members, a tradition that predated the current Alpha's tenure, and that would outlast it. Every family attended. The Alpha King presided. Any settlement member with a formal request could bring it forward during the open hour, which technically applied to everyone regardless of rank, though in practice the requests that received serious attention were proportional to the social position of the person making them. She had been preparing a formal request for 7 months. She wanted land. Specifically, she wanted the parcel of forest borderland that her grandmother had maintained for 30 years. Land that had been absorbed into formal pack territory under Kalen's border expansion program 4 years ago. It was a modest piece of ground, about 3 acres along the northern edge, bounded on one side by the settlement's fence line, and on the other, by the first real darkness of the deep forest. Her grandmother had kept it as a transition zone, an intermediate space that belonged fully to neither the human world nor the wild one. Animals had moved through it freely. It had served as a kind of buffer, an understood boundary that both sides of the forest line had learned to read correctly. Since it had been absorbed into patrol territory, that understanding had frayed. The forest animals were crossing the settlement boundary more frequently. The ancient wolves, which had been stable in their patterns for as long as anyone could remember, had started appearing closer to the settlement edge, and with a different quality of attention than before. Saren had been tracking this for 8 months. She had data. She had observations recorded in her own journal, written in the same small controlled handwriting she had learned from Alara. She had a proposal that was specific, practical, and low cost. She also knew precisely how it was likely to be received. She was an Omega, and a solitary one, without family connections to give her social weight or counsel allies to speak on her behalf. She had no rank in the hierarchy. She had only what she was proposing, which was sensible and well documented, and shaped by knowledge that no one in the pack's leadership structure possessed, because no one in the pack's leadership structure had been paying the kind of attention she had been paying for her entire life. She had watched her grandmother go to people with knowledge they did not want to receive, and she understood the particular frustration of being right, in a room that had decided, before you opened your mouth, that you were probably wrong. She was going to ask anyway. Alara would have asked. Alara had always asked, and had lived with the answers she received, and had kept doing the work regardless, because the work needed doing, and she was the one there to do it. Saren turned the journal page. Her grandmother's handwriting continued in the same small, steady lines. Outside, a wind had come in from the north, carrying the smell of pine resin and cold earth, the particular smell of the deep forest on autumn mornings. She recognized it, the way she recognized the smell of her own kitchen. She had been breathing it her whole life. She kept reading. The fox slept on. The forest waited, as it always had, with the specific patience of something that has been there longer than anything around it, and expects to be there, long after everything around it is gone. She had been born in this cottage. She would probably die in it. That used to feel like a limitation. Now it felt like something else. Like an inheritance she was still in the middle of understanding. She closed the journal and went to check on the fox. It was warm now, its temperature dropping toward normal. She changed the dressing on its leg with clean hands and fresh material, and spoke to it in the same low voice, and the fox did not flinch. Small things, careful things, the kind of things that the settlement around her had decided, collectively and without any particular malice, did not matter very much. She had stopped being surprised by that a long time ago. What she had not stopped doing was working anyway. The pack gathering was held in the central hall on the last Saturday of every month of autumn, in the last hour before noon. Saren arrived early. Not because she wanted a good position. She had long since learned that good positions in that hall were not available to her regardless of when she arrived, but because she had discovered, over years of attending these gatherings, that arriving early meant she could find a seat near the side wall, where she could see the full room, without being at the center of it. She was good at being near things without being inside them. It was a skill she had developed the same way she had developed most of her skills, through necessity and repetition, until it became natural. The hall filled steadily over the following 40 minutes. She watched people arrange themselves by the same invisible map they always followed. The Alpha Council occupied the raised section at the front. Senior pack families took the central floor seating. Younger families and lower-ranked members arranged themselves toward the back and sides. She recognized the architecture of it the same way she recognized the architecture of her grandmother's garden, shaped by logic that only became visible when you had been paying attention long enough. Kalen Duskmore arrived last, as was customary for the Alpha King. He walked in with his senior council, 5 individuals, 3 men and 2 women, all of them large and deliberate in the way of people who have spent their lives understanding that the way they move through space sends messages. Kalen himself wore a dark coat, no ceremonial additions. He had never needed ceremony, which was its own kind of statement. He stood at the front of the hall for a moment before sitting, looking across the assembled settlement with the unhurried attention of someone taking an inventory. His gaze moved across the room from left to right. It passed over Saren without pausing. The gathering opened with the standard procedures, monthly records, border reports, seasonal preparations. She listened to all of it carefully. She had learned, watching her grandmother, that information given in official settings was often important in indirect ways. The border report that morning included a brief note about increased animal activity in the northern sector. The patrol officer reading it described it as manageable and moved on. Saren wrote 2 words in the small notebook she had brought: 3 weeks. The formal request hour began after the official reports. The protocol was simple. Anyone who wished to make a request stepped forward to the speaking position in the center of the room and addressed the Alpha King directly. He would hear the request, ask clarifying questions if needed, and give an immediate response, or defer for deliberation. 3 requests came before hers: a family dispute over grazing rights, a request to extend the market trading hours for winter months, a petition about road repair in the southern residential lane. All 3 were handled efficiently, without drama. The Alpha King listened. He asked 1 or 2 questions in each case. His responses were brief and final. Saren waited. When her name was not called, requests were not pre-scheduled, they were self-initiated, meaning you stepped forward when you chose to. She stood up from her seat near the side wall and walked to the center of the room. She felt the shift in attention. Not dramatic, not hostile, simply the particular quality of a room recalibrating to something it had not expected. She was not a typical person to see in the speaking position. Omegas made requests sometimes, but usually through family representatives, usually for personal matters. She was walking to the speaking position alone, which was unusual. She stood in the speaking position and faced the Alpha King. Kalen Duskmore looked at her with the same unhurried attention he had given the previous 3 speakers. She met his gaze without difficulty. She had been practicing this in her kitchen for 7 months. Not the words, which she knew, but the physical act of standing in place and holding eye contact with an imagined version of his presence. "I am making a formal request regarding the northern borderland," she said. Her voice was steady. She had known it would be, because she had decided it would be, and Saren was someone who, when she decided something, usually managed to accomplish it. The 3-acre parcel that my grandmother, Ilara Ashfield, maintained as a transition zone for 40 years before her death, and which was absorbed into formal pack territory 4 years ago. There was a slight movement in the room. She did not look away from Kalen to track it. "I am requesting the return of that land to active use as a managed border sanctuary. I have prepared a detailed plan, a cost estimate, and observational data supporting this proposal." She held up the folder she had been carrying against her side. "I can leave these materials with the council for review, or summarize them here, or both. I am open to whatever process is most useful." She stopped. She had said what she came to say. She waited. Kalen Duskmore looked at her for a moment. She could not read his expression precisely. He was very good at keeping his face under control, which was a skill powerful men often developed. But she noticed that whatever he was doing behind his eyes, it was not nothing. He was looking at her with a kind of attention that was different from the inventory sweep he had given the room when he arrived. This was something more specific, and she could not tell yet whether specific was good or not. "Your grandmother," he said slowly. "Ilara Ashfield." "Yes." "She tended animals." He said this as a statement rather than a question. "Among other things, yes." A beat of silence. Then something happened in his expression. Something small and deliberate. A shift she might have missed if she had not been watching carefully. He leaned back slightly. The corners of his mouth moved. "You are proposing," he said, in the particular tone of a man who is constructing the frame of a joke while appearing to still be asking a genuine question, "to build a garden on the pack's borderland, so that animals will feel comfortable there. I am proposing a managed transition zone that would reduce border friction with the forest wildlife, which has been increasing in frequency over the past 3 seasons. The goal is not comfort. The goal is stability." She kept her voice even. She had prepared for this too. "Managed by you," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at his senior counsel beside him, and then back at her. "An Omega," he said, and here the deliberateness in his voice crystallized into something unmistakable, a tone that was performing bemusement for the audience as much as it was directed at her, who believes she can manage what our trained patrol teams cannot. The room reacted, not with loud laughter, with the particular sound of a room that has been given permission to dismiss something, a shift of shoulders, a shared exhale, a sound that was close enough to amusement to be indistinguishable from it. "You think," he continued, with the easy confidence of someone who knows the room is with him, "that wild animals from the deep forest want a cottage garden and a soft voice." More of that sound from the room. Saren did not move. She did not look at the room. She looked at Kaylin Duskmore, and she waited until the sound settled, and then she said in a voice that required no performance to be heard clearly, "I think the forest animals have been crossing the northern border with increasing frequency for 8 months, and the patrol team's current methods have not changed that. I have data on this, if it would be useful." A shorter silence. Then Kaylin said, "We appreciate your interest in the settlement's welfare," in a tone that indicated the conversation was over. "The pack will continue to manage the northern border through its established channels. Thank you for your time." She looked at him for one moment longer. She picked up her folder, which was still closed because she had never been invited to open it. She said, quietly and without inflection, "Thank you for your time," and walked back to her seat near the side wall. The room moved on to the next matter. She sat down. She had not flinched. She had not cried. She had not made the mistake of performing dignity, because dignity was not a performance, it was a fact, and facts did not require an audience. She sat in her seat near the wall, her folder on her lap, and she listened to the rest of the gathering with the same attention she had given the beginning. What she felt, privately, was something more complicated than anger. Anger would have been simpler to manage. What she felt was the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from having prepared something very carefully and then watching someone discard it without looking at it. And underneath the exhaustion, something she could not quite call grief, more like the recognition that she had known this was the likely outcome, and knowing a likely outcome did not protect you from the weight of it when it actually arrived. After the gathering ended, she walked home in the autumn sun, with her folder of data under her arm, and a fox to check on, and her grandmother's journals still unread on the kitchen table. Old Marin, the herb keeper, who had been sitting 3 seats away from her along the wall, caught her eye as they moved toward the exit. Marin said nothing. She simply looked at Saren in a way that communicated something complex and private, something that had to do with understanding what had just happened, without being willing to say so in a room that was still full of people. Saren nodded once. She went home. The fox was awake when she came through the door, sitting up carefully on the work table, testing weight on its healing leg, with the careful precision of an animal that has decided recovery is worth working toward. It looked at her when she came in, and she looked at it, and she set her folder of data down on the kitchen table beside her grandmother's journals, and she made tea, and she thought about what Kaylin Duskmore had said. He had said it in front of everyone. That was the part that was intended to do the most damage, the public nature of it, the invitation to the room to join in. She understood the mechanics well enough. Public dismissal was more effective than private dismissal because it recruited witnesses, and witnesses became enforcers. After a room had laughed, or done the thing that was close enough to laughing, the target of that laughter became slightly less possible to take seriously for everyone who had been present. It was efficient. It was calculated, even when it was reflexive. It was the social equivalent of what she had watched clumsy patrol officers do when they approached frightened animals. Move too fast, use too much force, achieve the opposite of what they were trying to achieve. She sat with her tea. She thought about her grandmother's journal. The silver one came out of the tree line and stood at about 40 meters. I sat down on the cold ground and waited. She thought about the northern border and the increased crossings and the data in her folder that no one in that room had looked at. She thought about the ancient wolves. She picked up the next journal in the stack and opened it to where she had last left a marker. She kept reading. Outside, the autumn afternoon settled over Ironvale. Inside the cottage, the fox took one careful step, then another, and then settled back down on its side with the satisfied expression of something that has decided it is exactly where it should be. 3 days after the gathering, a parcel arrived at her gate. It was wrapped in plain cloth and contained a bundle of specialized wound care herbs that she had been trying to source for weeks. There was no note. She recognized the herbs as being from Marin's stock. She stood in her garden holding the bundle for a moment. Then she went inside and added them to her cabinet. The following morning, a young man she did not recognize knocked on her gate just after dawn. He was carrying a lamb with a badly twisted front leg, and he had the expression of someone who had been told she was worth trying. She brought the lamb inside and set the leg properly, and told him to come back in 4 days. He asked her how much. She told him not to worry about it for now. She was not sure what to make of these things yet. They were small. They might mean nothing beyond individual choices made by individual people. She had not decided what to do with the data she still had in her folder. She had not decided whether to try again at the following month's gathering, or wait, or try a different approach entirely. What she had decided was that the work still needed doing regardless of what any Alpha King said in any public hall. The fox needed to heal. The lamb needed its leg set. Her grandmother's journals needed to be read. The northern border needed someone paying careful attention to it. She got on with it. She was not someone who could be stopped by a room that laughed. She had been raised, after all, by someone who had never been stopped by that either. The stories had been circulating in Ironvale for years, but stories that did not fit the established hierarchy tended to move in quiet ways, passed between people who were not in the habit of speaking loudly, saved for private conversations at market stalls after the official business was done, shared in the way of things that everyone who needed to know them already knew them, and everyone else had not yet thought to ask. Halric Owen had been collecting these stories for 3 years. He was Kalen Duskmore's senior beta, the Alpha King's closest advisor, the man responsible for the administrative machinery of Ironvale's pack structure. He was 51 years old, precise in his habits, and constitutionally skeptical of anything that came to him pre-interpreted. He had developed, over 30 years in pack management, a preference for gathering information in its raw form and doing the interpretation himself, because interpretation done by other people almost always contained the shape of what those people wanted to be true. He kept a field journal. He had kept one since he was 19. There were 22 of them now, lined up on the shelf in his office in the pack administration building. He had never shown them to anyone. They contained observations and nothing else. No conclusions, no judgments, no personal commentary beyond the occasional margin note to himself to follow up on a particular thread. The journal was a tool, not a diary. His first entry about Saren Ashfield was from 3 years ago, recorded in November, after a conversation with the Border Patrol officer named Glenn Marsh. Glenn Marsh had told him, carefully, with the specific care of someone who is not sure their report will be welcomed, about an incident at the northern border 6 weeks prior. A wolf had come out of the forest alone, which was unusual. It was injured. The 3 officers who encountered it had followed standard protocol. Deterrence first, withdrawal if the animal did not retreat. The wolf had not retreated. It had not responded to the deterrence at all. Not in a threatening way. Simply in the way of an animal that was doing something specific and was not going to stop doing it because of noise. What it was doing, as far as Glenn could describe, was waiting. The 3 officers had been in a standoff with it for about 20 minutes, when Saren Ashfield had appeared from the direction of the tree line. She had been out on one of her regular morning walks. She had seen the situation, assessed it for about 10 seconds, and then walked forward through the patrol line toward the wolf. The officers had called after her. She had not stopped. She had walked to within about 15 meters of the animal, and then crouched down, making herself smaller, and spoken in a low voice. The wolf had looked at her. Then it had walked toward her, slowly, directly, without any of the body language that preceded an attack. It had stopped about 2 meters away from where she was crouched. She had done something with her hand, an open, turned-down gesture, something she apparently did without thinking about it. And the wolf had lowered its head, turned, and walked back into the forest. The whole thing had lasted about 4 minutes from the moment she arrived. Glenn had filed a standard incident report. He had noted the successful withdrawal of the animal, but had not attributed it specifically to Saren's intervention, partly because he was not sure how to write that in official language, and partly because he suspected his supervisor would ask him questions he didn't have answers to. He had told Halric about it privately, over a drink, a month later. Halric had written it down. The second entry was from the following spring, sourced from a different officer, a woman named Clara Briggs who ran the Western Patrol Line. Clara had been more direct about what she'd seen, perhaps because she was newer to the job and had not yet learned which observations to file away quietly. She described a morning when a small pack of forest wolves, 5 of them, all young, which was itself slightly unusual, had been circling the settlement's western fence line. Standard behavior, in principle. Fence circling happened sometimes when the forest animals were hungry or the territory pressure was high. What was not standard was that they had been circling for 3 hours without the usual escalation or withdrawal. Clara had been about to call for backup when Saren Ashfield had come around the side of the fence on her morning walk. She had stopped and looked at the wolves for a moment. Then she had stepped over the low section of fence near the old storage barn, which was, technically unauthorized, since it put her into the unmanaged space between the settlement edge and the forest boundary, and she had walked along the outer fence line for about 50 meters, moving parallel to the wolves rather than toward them or away from them. After about 3 minutes of this, the wolves had stopped circling and started following her instead. She had walked them to the eastern gate of the unmanaged space, the one closest to where the old transition zone had been, before it was absorbed into patrol territory, and she had stood there for about 2 minutes. Then she had walked back over the fence into the settlement, and the wolves had stood at that eastern gate for a moment, and then dispersed into the forest. Clara had written a full report. It had been filed and received without comment. Halric had learned about it 6 months later, from Clara herself, when she mentioned it in passing during a planning meeting, and he had asked her to repeat it slowly. The third entry was different from the other 2, because it had not been given to him by a patrol officer. It had been given to him, unexpectedly and without any context being offered, by old Petra Linfield, who was not connected to the patrol system at all, but who was 73 years old and had lived in Ironvale her whole life and had a memory that Halric respected enormously. Petra had stopped him on the main lane one afternoon and said, without preamble, that she wanted to tell him something she had not told anyone else. She told him about a morning in the winter before Kaylin's father died, so, at least 15 years ago, when she had been walking near the northern border at dawn and had seen Alara Ashfield standing in the unmanaged transition zone with 5 or 6 of what Petra described as the big ones. Not ordinary wolves, the big dark ones that came out of the deep forest. She said Alara had been standing among them. Not beside them, among them. Like the way you stand in a room with people you have known for a long time, close enough that proximity is unremarkable. She said one of them had pressed its head against Alara's shoulder, the way a dog might lean against someone it trusted, and Alara had put her hand on the animal's neck without looking down. Petra said she had stood and watched for about 5 minutes. Then she had gone home and not told anyone, partly because she did not have a useful frame for it, and partly because she understood instinctively that Alara would not want the observation turned into a performance. I am telling you now, Petra had said, looking at Halric steadily, because I have seen that same girl, walking the same line, in the same hours, and I think you should know. Halric had written it down. He now had 11 entries. 11 independent accounts, from 11 different people, spread across a period of 4 years, all describing variations on the same core observation. Saren Ashfield moved through the animal world differently than other people did. Forest animals that were agitated or aggressive became calm near her. Animals that would not respond to standard deterrence withdrew when she arrived. She appeared to know things about animal behavior that were not in any manual, and she appeared to know them not as learned theory, but as something far more direct. He had not brought these entries to Kaylin's attention. He was aware that this was, technically, an omission in his advisory role. He had been considering why he was sitting on this information, and what his reasons were, and whether those reasons were good ones. He thought the reasons were something like this. Telling Kaylin about a single unusual sighting was straightforward. Telling him about 11 was different. 11 meant a pattern. And patterns required a response, and the response that Kaylin would likely reach for incorporating Saren's apparent ability into the pack's official system, putting it under formal management, giving her a sanctioned role, was a response that Halric suspected would not work, for reasons he could not fully articulate. Something in him believed that what Saren could do was not a talent that could be administered. It was something else. He wasn't ready to say what that something else was. He needed more data. He also, honestly, wanted to see what would happen on its own. In the days after the pack gathering, he had watched the room's response to Kaylin's public dismissal of Saren's request. He had watched Marin Stokes send an unmarked parcel to the northern cottage. He had noticed the young man with the lamb at her gate. He had noticed Clara Briggs, after the gathering, sitting quietly in the lunch hall, with a look on her face that was not quite a look he had a category for. He had written in his journal, in the margin of his entry from the gathering itself, waiting to see what the forest does. He did not know yet that he would not have to wait very long. The Northern Border Report from the following week noted, in the same understated language of all official patrol documentation, that animal activity in the sector had increased to an atypical level. The duty officer had flagged it for monitoring. Standard protocol. Halric read the report and made a note of his own. He went home that evening and looked at his shelf of field journals, 22 of them, and thought about patterns, and patience, and the fact that things which had been building for a long time often announced themselves all at once, without warning, in a way that made people feel they had been caught off guard, when in fact all the information had been available the entire time, if someone had been paying the right kind of attention. He had been paying attention. He went to bed thinking about the silver one that came out of the tree line and stood at 40 meters, and about a woman who had sat down on the cold ground and waited. He thought it was going to matter very soon. He was right. The Northern Border Patrol that same night recorded something in the log that had not been recorded in 30 years of official pack documentation. A patrol officer named Will Carver, 24 years old, and on only his 8th solo night shift, wrote the following in his standard report. Approximately 2:15 in the morning, I observed movement at the forest line in the northern sector. I counted at minimum 7 distinct wolf shapes, larger than the ordinary forest wolves. They did not cross the fence line. They stood at the edge and appeared to observe the settlement for a period of approximately 20 minutes. Then they returned into the forest interior. No engagement occurred. No deterrents were deployed. I did not feel that deploying deterrents would have been the correct response, though I am not sure I can explain why. His supervisor read the report the following morning and did not know how to respond to the last sentence, so he simply initialed it and moved on. Halric read it 2 hours later. He made a new entry in his journal. This one was longer than most. At the end of it, he wrote 2 words in the margin that he would return to many times in the weeks that followed. The words were, "She knows." He closed the journal and sat at his desk for a while, looking at his bookshelf. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and walked to the northern edge of the settlement. He stood at the fence line in the cold morning air and looked at the forest. The forest looked back. He stood there for about 10 minutes. Then he went back to his office and reopened his journal to a fresh page and began to think carefully about what Kaylin would need to understand and how he was going to explain it and how much time they might have before the situation required explaining in a way that no one could ignore. Not much time, he thought. Not much time at all. They came on a Tuesday in late October, just before dusk, when the sky was the specific shade of orange-gray that arrives in the hour before full darkness settles over the mountains. 9 of them. The first patrol officer to see them was Clara Briggs, who was finishing her afternoon shift on the northern fence line when her radio crackled with a call from the watchtower at the settlement's edge. She was already moving before the call finished, because she had learned 3 years ago, when she had watched a young woman walk 5 wolves to the eastern gate, to pay a different kind of attention to the northern border than the routine required. What she saw when she reached the watchtower observation platform made her go still for a moment. 9 wolves at the forest line, standing in a loose arrangement at the edge of the trees, where the deep forest gave way to the unmanaged grass of the old transition zone. They were not moving, they were not circling, they were positioned with a quality of intentionality that Clara had no official language to describe, so she described it the only way she could in her radio report. They are standing as if they are here for a reason. They were large. That was the first thing that registered after their number. Significantly larger than the ordinary forest wolves that the patrol team saw regularly, large enough that standing at 300 meters, she could see the difference clearly. Their fur was dark, moving through shades of deep gray and near black, and they held their weight with an absolute stillness that ordinary wolves, which fidgeted and adjusted and responded to environmental stimulus constantly, simply did not do. They were not fidgeting. They were not adjusting. They were standing in the way of something that has decided to be somewhere and has not yet decided to leave. The report reached the Pack Administration Building in 6 minutes. In 12 minutes, Halric Owen was reading it at his desk, with his field journal open in front of him, writing in the margin with a hand that was very steady. In 20 minutes, the senior counsel had been notified. In 25, Kalen Duskmore was at the northern fence line with his 3 lead Alpha units, 15 officers in total, armed with the full range of deterrence that the Pack's protocol provided for situations of elevated forest threat. The ancient wolves had not moved. Kalen stood at the fence line and looked at them across the grass of the old transition zone. The distance was approximately 80 meters. The wolves were clearly visible in the fading light. 9 distinct shapes, most of them standing, one lying down with the complete unconcern of an animal that had decided the situation required no particular physical readiness. He had encountered wolves before. He had been raised in a settlement that shared its border with the deep forest, and he had been involved in border management since he was 16. He had a functional, practical understanding of wolf behavior, built on the kind of information that official pack training provided. Behavioral patterns, escalation signals, the typical range of responses to deterrence, when to stand firm and when to give ground. None of that was useful right now. He could feel it in the way his lead unit was arranged beside him. There was a quality of stillness in them that was different from their usual operational steadiness. It was the stillness of people who are waiting for a category to resolve, and the category is not resolving. "Deploy warning charge, standard interval," he said. The warning charge went out. Sound and light, the combination that worked reliably on ordinary forest wolves, provoking immediate withdrawal in most situations. The 9 ancient wolves registered it the way a person registers a moderately loud noise in another room. Awareness, but no response. The one lying down did not stand up. The 8 standing ones did not shift their weight. Their attention remained directed at the settlement with the same quality it had carried since Clara first saw them from the watchtower. "Second charge," Kalen said. Second charge, same result. He stood at the fence line for a long moment. One of his senior officers, a man named Dorn, 20 years of patrol experience, said quietly, "These are not standard forest wolves. I know. Standard protocol is not going to move them. I know." 35 minutes into the standoff, the settlement behind them was fully aware of the situation. People were staying inside, as the emergency protocol required. But Halric could feel the particular pressure of a small settlement becoming anxious, which was a pressure he had learned to track carefully, because it had its own logic and its own timeline, and it affected decision-making in ways that did not always serve good outcomes. He stood behind Kalen's left shoulder and watched the wolves, and thought about his field journal and the 11 entries he had been keeping for 3 years, and he thought about the right moment to say the thing he had been preparing to say for a month. He was still calculating when a voice from behind him said, "Has anyone tried Saren Ashfield?" He turned. It was Petra Linfield's granddaughter, the young one, 17 years old, who was apparently here because she had been hauling water to the patrol line when the situation escalated, and had simply stayed. She was looking at the wolves with the direct expression of someone who has not yet learned which observations to keep private. The small group of officers around her went quiet. It was a specific quiet. Not hostile exactly, but loaded with the particular social discomfort of an idea that makes sense arriving from a direction that complicates agreeing with it. Halric looked at the girl for a moment. Then he looked at Kalen. The Alpha King's face went through several things in the space of about 4 seconds. Dismissal arrived first, and stayed the shortest time. Then something more calculated. Then something that Halric recognized, in 30 years of watching this man navigate decisions, as the specific expression of someone choosing between 2 things they do not want, and choosing the one that is less expensive. Kalen's jaw tightened very slightly. "Who is with her?" "She lives alone," Halric said. He said it without tone, which was the most useful thing he could do. "Does she know about this?" Kalen gestured toward the wolves. "No." Another silence. On the other side of the fence, the wolves had not moved. Send for her, Kalen said. The words were flat, which meant something had cost him something to say them. Halric had been watching him long enough to recognize the flatness. He nodded to one of the junior officers without comment, and the officer left at a run. Nobody in the group said anything about the pack gathering. Nobody said anything about what Kalen had said in that hall 3 weeks ago, in front of everyone, with the particular ease of a man who had never expected to need what he was currently sending for. The social structure of the pack did not provide language for this specific combination of events, and so the language was simply not used. The wolves waited. The settlement's administrative lights came on as full dark settled. The forest behind the wolves became a wall of black. The 9 shapes stood or lay in the grass of the old transition zone, illuminated now by the fence line's boundary lights, and the quality of their patience was something that Halric found difficult to look at directly for too long. It was the patience of something that existed on a different timeline than the one he was used to. A timeline measured in seasons and generations rather than hours and patrol shifts. He looked at his watch. 22 minutes had passed since they sent for Saren. He looked back at the wolves. He thought about Alara Ashfield standing among the big dark ones in the winter dawn, 15 years ago, with one of them pressing its head against her shoulder. He thought about a 2-month-old infant breathing in a cottage, and a woman sitting on cold ground, and a silver wolf coming forward through the grass 20 meters at a time. He thought about his journal entry, with the words "she knows" written in the margin. He heard footsteps behind him on the path from the settlement. He did not turn around immediately. He waited until the footsteps stopped, and then he turned. Saren Ashfield was wearing her work clothes. Her hair was pulled back loosely. She was still carrying a piece of cloth in her left hand that she had apparently been using when they found her, something to do with whatever animal she had been attending to. She looked at the fence line, at the patrol unit, at Kalen Duskmore standing at the head of it, and then past all of them at the wolves on the other side of the grass. Her expression when she saw the wolves was not surprise. It was something closer to recognition. She looked at them for about 20 seconds in silence. Then she said, in the quiet and even tone of someone reporting an observation, "They have been trying to reach someone for a long time, haven't they?" She did not make it a question. She said it the way you say a thing you have understood for a while and are only now saying out loud. Halric looked at Kalen. The Alpha King was looking at Saren with an expression that had gone very still. Nobody spoke. The wolves across the grass were standing again, all 9 of them now, including the one that had been lying down. Their attention had shifted. In the 20 seconds since she had arrived, it had shifted, as clearly as a compass needle shifts when north moves, from the general spread of the settlement and its lights and its population, to the specific point on the fence line where Saren Ashfield was standing. Halric wrote nothing down. He was past the point of notes. He simply watched. He felt, though he would not write this until later, that whatever happened next had been building for a very long time. She turned to look at the Alpha King then. She did not do it the way people usually looked at Kalen Duskmore, which was with the slight forward lean of someone performing readiness, the body unconsciously arranging itself into a shape that said, "I am aware of your authority." She looked at him the way she would have looked at Glenn Marsh or Clara Briggs or anyone else standing on a fence line in a situation that required practical decisions. "Do you want me to go out to them?" she said. It was a direct question. No performance in it, no making him feel better about saying yes, and no making him feel worse about what it meant that he was saying yes. Simply a question, the way you ask a question when the information the answer provides is more important than anything else around it. Kalen Duskmore, Alpha King of Ironvale, looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. She nodded once. She set the piece of cloth she had been carrying on the fence post beside her. She checked the gate latch, found it, and opened it. She stepped out into the grass of the old transition zone. No one spoke. No one moved. The patrol officers on the fence line held very still, in the way of people who have correctly understood that they are watching something they should not interrupt. The 9 ancient wolves, at 80 meters, watched her come. She walked at her own pace, which was not slow and not fast, and was completely without the kind of physical tension that people carry when they are afraid of something ahead of them. She moved the way she moved in her own garden, which was the way she moved anywhere, directly, without performance, as if the ground under her feet were ground she already knew. At 60 meters, the nearest wolf, the largest, the one closest to the center of the group, raised its head. At 40 meters she stopped. She stood still for a moment. Then she sat down in the grass. Halric heard the young patrol officer beside him exhale. Nobody else made a sound. She sat in the grass of the old transition zone, and the ancient wolves regarded her. The light from the settlement's boundary fence reached her in a pale wash, enough to see by but soft enough that the space she was in felt separate from the lit world behind her. The forest ahead was dark. The 9 wolves were shapes in that darkness, their eyes reflecting a quality of light that eyes reflect when the brain behind them is awake and attending to something. She sat cross-legged on the cold ground, the same position her grandmother had described in the journal entry. The same ground, give or take the precise location. The grass here was longer than inside the fence line, unmanaged now for 4 years, since the land had been taken into patrol territory, and no one had thought to do anything particular with it. The cold came up through it, and through her clothes, but she was accustomed to cold mornings, and cold evenings, and the kind of physical discomfort that came with spending time in outdoor spaces in autumn and winter. She let the silence settle. She did not speak immediately. This was one of the first things she had absorbed from Alara. Not the lesson about patience in the abstract, but the practical understanding that speaking before you have listened is a kind of presumption. You arrive, and you listen first. You find out what is already in the air before you add anything to it. What was in the air was something she had been sensing at a distance for months. Now, sitting in it directly, she could feel its texture more clearly. It was not urgency, exactly. It was closer to the quality of something that has been waiting for a specific condition to be met, and the condition has finally been met, and now the thing can proceed. She thought of her grandmother's word for this feeling. Not a formal word, just a word Alara used, a word from her own vocabulary, for things she did not have official language for. She called it the resuming, as in, this is a resuming, a return to something that was interrupted, not a new beginning. The largest wolf, the one who had raised its head when she stopped at 40 meters, walked forward now. It walked the way the ancient wolves always moved, which was different from the way ordinary wolves moved. Not faster, not slower, but with an unhurried directness that was entirely unaffected by the presence of the watching humans at the fence line. The other animals mattered to it less than zero right now. The only thing that mattered, in its attention, was her. Behind her, at the fence, someone made a small sound, an intake of breath perhaps. She did not look back. The wolf stopped at about 12 meters. They looked at each other. She began to speak. Her voice was low and completely even, not soothing in an artificial way, not a performance of calm designed to manage the animal. It was simply her ordinary speaking voice, adjusted slightly in volume for the distance and the open space. She spoke in the rhythm and cadence that she had used for the years of work in her cottage, the same voice she used with the fox and the lamb, and the dozens of other animals she had brought through her kitchen. The one that carried, in its quality rather than its content, the simple and consistent information. I am not a threat. I am paying attention. You can tell me what you came to say. She did not know, herself, whether she understood it as language. That was not the right frame. She was not translating. She was simply present. She was here, and they were here. And the conversation, if that was the right word for it, was something that happened at a level below words. Information moved. That was what she could say about it in the plainest terms. Something about her told them something about her, and something about them told her something about them. What they told her was this: the land. The 3 acres of border transition zone. The same land her grandmother had managed. The same land Saren had come to the gathering to ask for. That was what they had come about. Not in the human way of a formal claim, in the way of water finding a crack. They had come, because the absence of that managed space had created an absence they felt the edges of. The boundary zone that Alara had maintained had been, in some sense she had not fully understood until now, a communication. A standing, slow-moving conversation between the settlement and the forest, maintained by one person who spoke both languages, that had kept the forest's oldest residents informed that they were known and considered. When Alara died, the conversation had not been replaced. It had simply stopped. And then the land itself had been absorbed into the patrol system, and the patrol system did not know how to have the conversation, because it did not know the conversation was happening. What had started as a gap had become, over 11 years, a pressure. She understood this in the way she understood most things, not as theory, not as something she had thought her way toward, but as something she received directly from the situation she was sitting inside. It was information. She was simply taking it in. She talked for a while. She did not give a speech. She acknowledged what she was hearing. She said, in her own way, that she understood. She said, in the language of consistency and presence rather than the language of promises, that she intended to resume. She did not know if they heard the specific content. She suspected they did not hear it the way a person hears words. She suspected that what arrived was something more like a signal, like the quality of her intention, the emotional and behavioral fact of it, rather than the verbal shape of it. She had thought about this a great deal over the years, in the way of a person who interacts daily with creatures that communicate beautifully without any shared language, and who has had to develop their own framework for understanding what is actually happening. Ilara had written about this in the journals. They do not listen to what you say, she had written. They listen to whether you are what you say. The words are irrelevant. The fact of you is not. The fact of Saren was apparently satisfactory. The large wolf stepped forward. It came within 3 meters of her, close enough that she could see the silver streaking through its dark fur, could hear its breathing, could feel the specific presence of something very large and very old in the small space between them. It looked at her with the amber eyes that all of them had, the color precise and deep, and she looked back. It pushed its muzzle forward briefly, toward her direction, not touching, just directing, and then pulled back. It turned its head, looked at the forest behind it, and then back at her. She understood. She nodded once, which was probably not a gesture it recognized, but it was the thing her body did. The large wolf turned and walked back toward its group. She stayed sitting for another 2 minutes. Around her, the night settled. She became aware again of the cold, and of the boundary lights behind her, and of the people watching from the fence line. She heard the distant sound of the settlement, a door closing, the low murmur of radio communication from the patrol, and it felt very far away. Then she stood up, brushed the cold grass from her work clothes, and walked back toward the fence line. She did not look at the wolves as she walked away. She did not need to. She knew from the quality of the silence behind her that they were watching until she was all the way back. And then, in the time it took her to cross the 80 meters of transition zone and reach the gate, she heard the sound of the forest changing, the specific movement of large bodies in undergrowth, unhurried, going exactly where they intended to go. When she turned at the gate, the old transition zone was empty grass in the boundary light. The 9 wolves were gone. She latched the gate behind her. The patrol unit was very quiet. Clara Briggs was looking at her with an expression that was not quite identifiable. The young officer, Will, she thought his name was, she had met him once at the market, was standing very still with his hands at his sides and his mouth slightly open. Halric Owen was writing in his journal. He wrote for about 20 seconds without looking up. Then he closed the journal and looked at her, and his expression was more than she could fully read, but she thought there was in it something that was neither surprise nor not surprise, but rather the particular look of a person who has been gathering data for a long time and has just received the piece that makes the whole pattern clear. She looked past him at Kalen Duskmore. The Alpha King was standing at the fence line where he had been for the past hour. His senior officers were on either side of him. He was looking at the empty grass of the transition zone, where 9 ancient wolves had stood 20 minutes ago, and he was not yet looking at her. She waited. After a moment, he turned. He looked at her for a long time. His expression was doing several things. She could see them moving through his face. Things that he was not accustomed to letting move through his face in front of people. She did not say anything. She had said what she needed to say tonight, and she had said it to the ones who needed to hear it. What Kalen Duskmore said, or did not say in the next few minutes, was information too, but it was information she could wait for. She was good at waiting. He looked at her, and behind his eyes something was resolving. She stood in the boundary light in her work clothes, and she waited for it to finish. Dorn, Kalen's most senior patrol officer, was the first to speak. She should go in and get warm, he said, addressing no one in particular. Not Saren, not the Alpha King, just the air around them. The practical observation of a man who had spent 20 years making practical observations and had learned when to let practicality carry the weight. Yes, Halric said, without looking up from where he was still thinking. Everyone should. People began to move. The patrol unit began the process of standing down, which was a process with its own steps and its own momentum, and it gave everyone somewhere to put their attention, while the larger thing settled. Clara Briggs walked past Saren on the way in. She didn't stop. She put her hand briefly on Saren's shoulder, a light, quick touch, the kind that says I saw it, and not another word, and then she was past her, and heading toward the equipment storage. Will, the young officer, stopped in front of her for a moment. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Then he said, "I've never seen anything like that in my life." "No," Saren agreed simply. He nodded, apparently satisfied with the exchange, and followed the others. She stood and waited until most of the patrol had dispersed. The cold was thorough now. She had been out for nearly an hour in work clothes, and the transition zone grass had been damp. She was aware of wanting to go home, check on her animals, make tea, and sit in the quiet of her kitchen with her grandmother's journals. She was also aware of the Alpha King, who had not yet left. He was standing a few meters away, still looking at the place where the wolves had been. His senior counsel had given him space, drifted slightly off to the side in the way of people who understand when the primary person in a situation needs a moment that is not performed in front of an audience. She could leave. There was no protocol that required her to stay, but she did not leave, because she was curious, genuinely curious, in the way she was curious about most things, as a question without an emotional investment in any particular answer. She wanted to see what the next few minutes produced. What they produced was Kalen Duskmore, Alpha King, turning from the empty transition zone to face her. His expression had settled into something she had not seen on his face before, because she had only ever seen his face when it was being used in public for public purposes, at the gathering, at the market, at the seasonal events where his presence was part of the proceedings. What was on his face now was not that. What was on his face now was something simpler and less curated. He looked, for the first time she had ever seen, like a person who did not know exactly what to say. She waited. "Is there anything you need tonight?" he said finally. It came out less formal than it might have intended to be, and it landed in the space between them slightly unprotected, the way words do when the person saying them is not sure whether they have chosen the right ones. She thought about this for a moment. "I would like my scarf back," she said. "I left it on the fence post." Something moved across his face that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of a very short laugh. He turned, found the scarf on the post where she had put it, and picked it up. He walked it to her. He held it out and she took it, and for about 3 seconds they were close enough to each other that she could see, with some clarity, that he was tired, in the way of a person who has been carrying a wrong assumption for long enough that they have forgotten it was an assumption rather than a fact. She wrapped the scarf around her neck. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. Then she turned and walked toward the settlement gate, toward the side path, toward her cottage and her garden and her animals, and the rest of her grandmother's journals. She did not know, walking home that night in the cold with her scarf around her neck, exactly what came next. She had a sense that things had shifted, and that the shift was significant, and that the shape of her life in Ironvale was going to be different in some way she couldn't fully predict yet. What she knew for certain was that the ancient wolves had come, and that they had been answered, and that the work could now resume. She opened her gate, went inside, and put the kettle on. By the following morning, 47 people knew what had happened. By evening of the same day, the number was closer to 200. By the second morning, there was no one in Ironvale who had not heard some version of it. This was the nature of a settlement of 400 people. Information moved the way water moves in a container, filling every available space, regardless of whether anyone intended it to. People told their families. Families told their neighbors. The 47 officers and council members who had been on the northern fence line the previous evening were not capable, collectively, of maintaining discretion about something with that much weight to it. It was not gossip exactly. It was the specific kind of information that passes between people because it is too large not to discuss, because something about it requires the act of telling another person in order to begin to make sense of it. The version that moved through Ironvale was not distorted in the usual way of things passed through many mouths. It was simplified, but the core of it remained intact. The ancient wolves had come, the Alpha King's teams had been unable to move them, and Saren Ashfield, who had been publicly dismissed at the pack gathering 3 weeks prior, had walked out alone and talked to them, and they had left. That was the story. It was accurate, and it sat in the settlement with the specific weight of things that cannot be unknown. Saren was aware of the information moving. She could feel it, the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not a specific sensation, but a quality of things that was different than it had been. People she had never spoken to nodded at her in the main lane. A woman she did not know stopped her at the market gate to ask if she needed help carrying anything, in the careful tone of someone who wants to acknowledge something but has not decided quite how. 3 different families sent requests to her cottage in a single day, all relating to animals. All of them the kind of requests that would previously have gone to the official pack veterinary office. She handled all of it the same way she handled everything, directly, without performing either significance or modesty. She did the work, she answered the requests, she was polite to the people who nodded at her, and brief with the people who wanted to talk about the previous evening, and not available for the version of the conversation where she was supposed to feel triumphant, because she did not feel triumphant. She felt, if anything, tired and focused, and aware that there was a great deal still to do. What she was most aware of, in the days after the wolves came, was the northern border. She walked it each morning, as she always had. But now she walked it differently, with a sharper quality of attention, with the specific heightened awareness of a person who knows that something has been communicated and is waiting to understand the full scope of it. She looked at the transition zone grass and thought about what the large wolf had shown her. The feeling of return, the resuming, the suggestion, in the animal's presence and movement, of a continuity that had been interrupted and needed to be restored. Her grandmother's land. It was still, technically, pack territory. Kaylin had not reversed anything. Nothing administrative had changed. She still did not have access to those 3 acres for the purpose she had proposed at the gathering. The wolves' arrival had made many things clear, but it had not automatically changed the structural situation. Structures do not change because something dramatic happens. Structures change because someone with the authority to change them decides to change them, and that decision is made through its own process, on its own timeline. She gave Kaylin the time she thought he probably needed. She did not go to the administration building. She did not send a formal communication. She waited in the practical way of someone who has something to say, but understands that the timing of when you say it matters as much as the content. Meanwhile, she kept reading her grandmother's journals. She was in the 4th year of Ilara's records now, the year before Saren's parents left. These were the densest journals, full of detailed observation notes, long entries about the ancient wolves and their behavioral patterns across the seasons, careful notes about the transition zone's effect on the settlement's general relationship with the forest. What was striking, reading them now, was how clearly Ilara had understood what she was doing. She had not been simply a woman who liked animals. She had been maintaining an intentional relationship between the human settlement and the wild territory beside it, and she had understood the relationship's function well enough to document it with the seriousness of someone who knew it needed to outlast her. I am thinking, Ilara had written in an entry from late October, in a year when Saren would have been about 3 years old, about what happens to this when I am gone. The pack has its protocols for the forest border, but the protocols address containment and management, not relationship. They are built on the assumption that the forest is a problem to be solved rather than a neighbor to be known. I am not sure how to change an assumption that is embedded so deeply in the way the structure thinks. I am not sure it can be changed from inside the structure. I think it has to be shown. I think what is required is a circumstance so clear that the structure cannot argue with what it has seen. Saren read this 3 times in the kitchen, in the same chair she always sat in, with the same view of the north-facing window. Her grandmother had been thinking about this for decades. The journals were not just notes. They were, she was beginning to understand, a preparation. A preparation for the moment when the thing Ilara was doing would need to be demonstrated so clearly that even a pack system built on rank and containment could not dismiss it. A circumstance so clear that the structure cannot argue with what it has seen. She set the journal down and looked at the window for a while. Halric Owen came to her cottage on the 3rd day. He came alone, without announcing himself, and knocked on the gate in the early afternoon, when she was in the back garden checking on the fox's progress. She heard the knock, recognized his careful, deliberate rhythm. She had come to know the sounds of different visitors to her gate over the years, and Halric's was distinct, and wiped her hands on her work apron and went around to let him in. I have some questions, he said, when she opened the gate. He held up his field journal in a way that was both practical and slightly apologetic. Here is the instrument. I intend to use it. I thought you should know. Come in. she said. I'll make tea. They sat at her kitchen table. The fox, which was now walking on all four legs and had begun to show some interest in the outside world through the window, sat on the work table and watched them with the detached curiosity of a creature that had decided it was safe here, but had not yet decided whether humans were particularly interesting. Halric had 11 entries in his journal, he told her, spread over 3 years. He read several of them to her, not asking her to confirm or deny, simply letting her hear what he had been gathering. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she thought for a moment and then said, "That is mostly accurate." "Mostly," he said. "The one about the western fence. The wolves were not circling because the territory pressure was high. They were circling because one of the officers on the line had been moving in a pattern that the wolves were reading as challenge behavior. He probably did not know that. I did not explain it to him at the time, because I was not sure how to explain it without it sounding like criticism." Halric wrote something down. "And the transition zone," he said. "What is your understanding of why it matters?" She told him. She told him what the wolves had communicated to her in the clearing, and she told him what her grandmother's journals had documented, and she told him her own reading of the 11 years since Alara's death, and the 4 years since the land had been absorbed into Pact territory. She was direct and specific, and used no language that required him to accept anything she could not demonstrate. He listened carefully. He wrote steadily. He asked 2 clarifying questions, both of them precise and useful. He was, she noticed, very good at receiving information without filtering it through his preferences, which was a rarer quality than it should have been. When she finished, he sat for a moment. "The Alpha King needs to understand all of this," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "Are you willing to speak with him directly?" She looked at her tea. She thought about the pack gathering 3 weeks ago, and the sound of the room, and the closed folder on her lap. She thought about the fence line 2 nights ago, and the scarf on the post, and the expression on Kaylin's face that she had not quite been able to read, but that had contained, she was fairly sure, the first stage of something changing. "Yes," she said. Halric nodded. He made one more note. Then he closed his journal and set it on the table between them, and looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a person who has been thinking about something for 3 years and is no longer alone in thinking about it. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I had the information for some time. I did not bring it to him when I should have." She looked at him. "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think I was waiting to see whether the situation would make itself clear on its own. I thought if I presented the information prematurely, without a clear enough demonstration, it would be dismissed. I think I was probably right about that, but I was still making a choice that had consequences." She considered this. "You were trying to protect the information," she said, "from being dismissed before it was ready." He looked at her, and his expression shifted slightly. "That is a generous interpretation." "It might also be accurate," she said. He picked up his journal. He stood up from her kitchen table, and he thanked her for the tea, which she had not expected from a senior beta, and she walked him to the gate. He paused at the gate and turned back. "He will come to you," he said. "I think it will be soon. He is someone who processes quickly, when he cannot avoid processing something. The previous night did not give him anything to avoid." She thought about this. What should I expect? Halric considered the question with genuine care. "I think," he said slowly, "that you should expect him to be less prepared than he usually is, and I think that will be uncomfortable for both of you, in different ways. I think the best outcome is the one where you focus on what you came to say, rather than on how he is receiving it." She nodded. She understood that, deeply and practically. It was, after all, simply a version of sitting down in the grass and speaking in the low, even voice that carried the fact of you, rather than a performance of you. She could do that. He left. She latched the gate behind him, and stood in her garden for a moment in the cold afternoon air, looking at the north-facing wall of her cottage, above which the sky was the pale, flat gray of a late autumn afternoon. She thought about her grandmother's journals, about the word resuming, about the fact that Alara had been preparing the ground for this, in her patient and deliberate way, across decades, and had trusted that the right person would be in the right place when the moment arrived. She had not fully understood, until recently, that she was the person her grandmother had been preparing things for, not in the way of a legacy deliberately constructed, but in the simpler and more surprising way that someone who spends their whole life doing the right thing quietly has a way of producing, in the people who watch them closely, the capacity to do the same thing. Her grandmother had not taught her how to speak to the ancient wolves. Her grandmother had taught her how to pay attention. The rest had followed from that, the way most important things follow, not from being told what to do, but from understanding enough of the situation that the right thing presents itself clearly. She went back inside. The fox was standing at the edge of the work table, looking at the garden through the window with an expression of clear intent. She opened the side door that led to the enclosed garden space, and the fox jumped down from the table, landed carefully on its heeling leg, and walked outside to investigate its options. She watched it go. She thought, things that are healing need to move on their own terms, in their own time, at the pace that the healing allows. She thought, that applies to more than foxes. She made a fresh cup of tea and opened her grandmother's journals to the next unread page, and she read until the light went, which was not long on an autumn afternoon, and then she lit the lamp and kept reading, because there was still a great deal to understand, and the things her grandmother had left for her were patient enough to wait and precise enough to matter. Outside, the garden was quiet. The fox explored the perimeter with its careful three-legged walk, sniffing at the hedgehog grass and the toad mud and the winter bare branches of the small apple tree. It made a complete circuit and then sat in the center of the garden and looked up at the sky for a while. Then it came back inside and settled on the work table in the lamp's warm circle and went to sleep. Saren kept reading. Whatever was coming, she intended to be ready for it. He came on a Friday. Not a message first, not a scheduled appointment, not the formal advance notice that the Alpha King's office sent for anything that involved official business. He simply appeared at her gate on a Friday morning, alone, without his counsel, in a dark coat without any of the markings that his ceremonial appearances required. He knocked on the gate in a straightforward way, the way a person knocks when they have thought about what they are coming to do, and have decided to do it without further deliberation. Saren was in the kitchen when she heard it. She set down her tea and her grandmother's journal, and went to the gate and opened it. Kalen Duskmore stood on the other side of it. He looked, in the plain morning light, and without the architecture of an official setting around him, like a man in his mid-30s, who had not slept particularly well. He looked at her for a moment in silence, and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a few seconds, which was fine with her. She was patient. "I was wondering," he said, "whether you had time to speak." "I do," she said. "Come in." She stepped back, and he came through the gate, and she latched it behind him. He looked at the garden as he passed through it, taking it in without comment. The hedgehog grass, the toad mud, the branches of the apple tree. Whatever he made of it, he kept to himself. Inside, she put the kettle on without asking. Some decisions do not require consulting the other person. He sat at her kitchen table in the chair that was across from the one she usually used, and he looked at the journals on the table and at the work table where the fox was sleeping in the lamp's warmth, and he was quiet while the kettle heated. She poured tea and put a cup in front of him and sat down with her own cup. The kitchen was warm and smelled the way it always smelled, herbs and wood smoke and the underlying things she had never been able to name, and the fox slept, and the lamp burned, and the late autumn light came through the north-facing window in a pale, flat way. He wrapped his hands around the cup. He did not speak immediately. She waited. She was beginning to understand that his way of entering a difficult conversation was from the side rather than the front, circling the thing at distance until he found the approach he could take without feeling exposed. She recognized the strategy. She had seen it in certain animals too. Not a deceptive thing, just the behavior of a creature that had learned to be careful about where it put its weight. "The northern borderland," he said finally. "Your grandmother's land." "Yes." "What would you actually build there?" She told him. She had told him once before, briefly, in the speaking position at the gathering, from the frame of a formal request to a person who had already decided how to receive it. This time she told him the way she told things when the audience was genuinely listening, fully, specifically, with the details that gave the proposal its shape and texture, the 3 acres and what she would do with them, the buffer zone structure, the monitored transition corridor, the seasonal patterns of the forest's large animals, and what a properly managed border space would mean for those patterns over time. She brought out her maps. She had drawn them herself, carefully, over 7 months. She spread them on the kitchen table, and pointed to the specific areas she was describing, and he leaned forward to look at them. He put his elbows on the table, which was not a posture she had ever seen him use in a public setting, and looked at the maps with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely trying to understand rather than evaluating whether to approve. He asked questions. Real questions, not the kind designed to create openings for dismissal, but the kind that fill in gaps. He asked about cost. She had numbers. He asked about management. Who would maintain the space, how it would be monitored, what protocol would govern contact between the sanctuary and the patrol territory. She had answers to all of it, because she had been thinking about all of it for 7 months, and the questions he was asking were ones she had asked herself. At some point during this conversation, she could not have said exactly when, the quality of the exchange changed. It was not a dramatic change. The light through the window did not alter, the fox did not stir, but the room shifted slightly, in the way that rooms shift when the people in them have stopped performing and started talking. He was no longer the Alpha King at the kitchen table of a low-ranked Omega. He was a man looking at maps and asking questions in the way of a person trying to solve a problem, and she was a person with the best available knowledge of the problem, and the problem was real and present and required solving. She thought, watching this happen, that it was one of the things she had learned from 20 years of working with animals. Status and rank are overlays. They are real overlays, with real effects in the social world. But underneath them there is usually something simpler and more workable. The actual situation, and the actual people, and the actual question of what needs to be done. There is one more thing, she said, when she had finished the main part of what she had come to say. He looked at her. She talked about the communication layer, not the practical management of the border space, but the other thing, the relationship that Alara had maintained with the ancient wolves, the conversation that had been happening for 40 years, and had gone quiet, 11 years ago, and had been absent in a way the forest felt. She did not use her grandmother's language for it, she used her own. Plain, specific, grounded in what she had observed directly, and what she could demonstrate. She told him what the large wolf had communicated in the clearing. She told him what her grandmother's journals documented about the function of a managed transition space in the broader context of the settlement's relationship with the deep forest. She watched his face while she talked. He did not dismiss it. That was the first thing she noticed. He also did not perform openness in a way that would have been unconvincing. He listened with the same focused attention he had given the maps, and his expression had the particular quality of someone integrating new information into a structure that is having to make room for it. She finished speaking. She picked up her tea, which had gone cool, and waited. He was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Then he said, "Your grandmother understood this for 40 years. Yes. And the records I have of that period treat her land as agricultural support space. There is no record in our documentation of anything she was managing beyond standard animal care." "No," she agreed. "There would not be." He thought about this. Did she try to explain it? Saren considered. "I think she explained it when it seemed useful," she said. "I do not think she required people to understand it in order to keep doing it. Understanding was not the point. The work was the point." Something in his expression was affected by this, in a way he did not visibly try to control. She noticed it, and did not comment on it. He looked at the maps on the table for another moment. Then he looked up at her. "I want to give you the land," he said. He said it without preamble, and without the formal framing that official decisions were usually wrapped in. Just the sentence, plainly. The 3 acres. "I want to make it an official sanctuary space under your management, with formal coordination with the Northern Patrol team." She looked at him. "I would want to review the coordination protocol before it is finalized. There are some things I would need to be specific about in terms of how the patrol team operates in that area." He nodded. "That is reasonable. And I would want a formal record of what the space is for, not for my sake, for the record, so that the next person who manages it has the documentation they need, and the PAC administration understands the full nature of what the space does." He looked at her for a moment when she said this. She thought he was hearing what she was actually saying, not just "I want my grandmother's land back," but "I want what my grandmother did to be visible and recorded, so that it is not lost again the way it was lost before." "I understand," he said. "I would also," she said, and here she paused for a moment, because this was the part she had been most uncertain about bringing forward, like to consult on the Northern Border Protocol more broadly. Not to manage it, that is the patrol team's role. But there are things I can see in how the forest animals are behaving that are useful for the patrol team to know, and currently there is no channel for that information to move. He looked at her steadily. What kind of formal arrangement would work for that? She had thought about this. She told him what she had thought. He listened. He asked 2 more questions. Then he said he would have Halric draft the structure and send it to her for review. She nodded. He picked up his tea and finished it. He looked at the sleeping fox on the work table for a moment. That is the fox from the fence post, he said. An observation rather than a question. Yes, its leg is healing well. He looked at the fox for another moment. Then he stood up and put his coat on, and said that he appreciated her time. He said it the way you say something when you mean it, rather than when you are filling the air between a finished meeting and a departure. She walked him to the gate. She opened it, and he stepped through it. He paused outside it. The gathering, he said. He did not finish the sentence. He was looking at the lane, not at her. It was 3 weeks ago, she said. We are talking now. He turned and looked at her when she said this. His expression did something brief and complex. Then he nodded, and he walked away down the lane, and she watched him go for a moment, before she latched the gate and went back inside. The fox was awake when she came in, sitting up on the work table with its amber eyes open. It looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention of an animal that has decided you are worth looking at. She sat down at the kitchen table. She sat there for a while without picking up any journal or any cup. She thought about her grandmother's word, resuming. She thought, yes, that is what this is. Halric's draft arrived 2 days later, delivered to her gate by a junior administrative officer who handed it over with the slightly careful expression of someone who was aware that the document they were carrying was not entirely ordinary. She thanked him, brought it inside, and read it at the kitchen table with fresh tea and a pencil in her hand. It was well drafted. Halric had listened carefully in their conversation, and the structure he had built reflected what she had described with good precision. She made 4 notes in the margin, 2 clarifications, 1 substantive change to the patrol coordination language, and 1 addition to the documentation requirements section. She rewrote 1 paragraph from the beginning, because the original version made the consultation arrangement sound more like a service she was providing to the patrol team, and less like a formal advisory function, and the distinction mattered for how the role would be understood in practice over time. She sent it back with her notes the following morning. Halric's revisions arrived the same afternoon. He had incorporated all 4 of her changes and added a note in the margin of the documentation section in his small, precise handwriting. The record should include historical context going back to E. Ashfield's tenure. I will source what exists in the patrol archives. Please advise what you can add from your own records. She read this note twice. Then she wrote back. I have 11 years of her field journals. They are detailed. I will begin organizing the relevant material. It was the first time she had offered the journals to anyone. She was aware of what she was offering. She was offering her grandmother's life's work, not as her private inheritance, but as a public record, as the documentation that Ilara had always intended to exist, even if she had not lived long enough to see it formally received. She thought that was right. She thought her grandmother would have thought so too. She opened the earliest journal, the one from the year Saren was born, and she found a fresh piece of paper, and began to mark the entries that needed to be included. She worked until late. The fox slept. The lamp burned. Outside, the autumn deepened toward winter, and the forest to the north was quiet, in the way of a place that has received what it came for, and is waiting to see what follows. She marked another page, then another. Her grandmother's handwriting filled the pages in its small, careful script, patient and precise, describing decades of attention paid to a world that most of the settlement had not thought worth paying attention to. She would copy it out neatly. She would organize it. She would add her own observations, from the 8 months of data she had kept, and from everything she had understood since. She would make it a record that could not be lost again. That was the work. She got on with it. The sanctuary did not announce itself. It simply began. On the 1st of December, Saren received the formal land grant, a document from the Pack Administration Office, signed by Kaelin Duskmore and countersigned by Halric Owen, that returned the 3 acres of northern borderland to active use as a managed sanctuary under her direction. The language was clear and specific, and the documentation section at the end described the space's purpose in terms that went further than she had expected, acknowledging the transition zone's role in the broader relationship between the settlement and the deep forest, and establishing a formal requirement for the historic record to be maintained. She read the document twice at her kitchen table. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the drawer where she kept her grandmother's oldest journals, the ones too fragile to handle regularly, the ones that contained the earliest records of Ilara's work. She put the document there because it belonged with that material. It was the same project, continued. She started work on the land the following weekend. The ground was cold, and the grass was long, and the fence that had been put up when the land was absorbed into patrol territory was a low wire construction that was practical and graceless and did not know what it was guarding against. She did not take it down immediately. She left it in place because the patrol team's comfort with the transition mattered, and she had learned, from Halrich's draft and from her own long experience, that the rate at which you change physical structures should match the rate at which the people who have to work alongside those structures are ready for the change. What she did instead was begin the slower work of the space itself. She walked the 3 acres systematically, in the cold December air, assessing what was there. The land had not been managed for 4 years, but it had not been mistreated either, which was something. There were areas of thick grass that would work well for small animals. There was a low depression near the eastern edge where water pooled seasonally, which was a resource she had not known about, and which, properly managed, would be significant. The soil along the forest side boundary was different from the settlement side soil, richer, darker, the product of the forest ecosystem's influence over many years. Her grandmother had known this. There were references to the eastern soil quality in the journals from as early as 15 years before Saren was born. She worked alone for the first 3 weekends. On the 4th, Clara Briggs appeared at the northern fence gate on a Saturday morning, with work boots on, and asked if there was anything she could carry. Saren looked at her for a moment. "Can you carry fencing materials?" "Yes." "Then come in." Clara came in. She did not ask many questions. She was a practical person who was more comfortable doing than discussing, which was a quality Saren respected, and they worked together for 4 hours on the replacement of the wire fence section nearest the forest boundary, with a lower, wider structure that allowed the passage of small animals while maintaining a clear and visible demarcation that the patrol team could work with. Clara came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after. She brought the young officer Will the 3rd time, because Will, it turned out, had grown up in a farming family and knew things about land management that were useful in specific and practical ways. He was also very good at carrying heavy things without being told, which was a virtue she appreciated. They were not a formal team. Nobody gave them a title or assigned them to the project. They simply showed up, which was the way Saren had always understood that real things got built, not through announcements or structure, but through people who found something worth doing and kept doing it. By mid-February, the sanctuary had taken a shape she could recognize as beginning. The low depression had been cleared and given a proper edge so the water pooling would be deliberate rather than accidental. The grass management was underway. Areas left long where they should be long. Areas cleared where clarity mattered. She had put up 3 monitoring points around the perimeter, simple observation structures built from local timber that gave a clear line of sight to the forest boundary without imposing on the space. She was out there on a Tuesday morning in late February, checking the water collection at the eastern depression, when she looked up and saw one of the ancient wolves at the forest edge. Not all 9, just the one, the large one, the one that had come to her in the clearing. It stood at the tree line and watched her work for about 10 minutes. She did not stop working. She did not perform awareness or acknowledgement. She kept her head down and continued what she was doing, and the wolf watched, and the morning passed, and then it was gone. She wrote it in her observation journal when she got back to the cottage. The date, the time, the duration, the location, the quality of the observation. She had started her own field journal for the sanctuary the day the land grant was signed, in the same small controlled handwriting she had absorbed from her grandmother without being taught it. The observation was brief. Single animal, northeast tree line, approximately 10 minutes, no approach, no vocalization, apparent observation of the space. She added a note at the bottom, resuming. The formal coordination protocol with the Northern Patrol Team came into effect in January, 3 weeks after the land grant. She had 1 meeting per month with the patrol duty officer. Clara, in practice, since Clara had taken on the Northern Sector coordination role when it became clear that she was the officer with the most relevant background for it, and she gave a summary of what she had observed in the sanctuary and the adjacent forest area, and Clara gave a summary of what the patrol had observed, and together, they built a picture that neither one of them could have built independently. The first meeting was slightly uncomfortable. Not between Saren and Clara. They had moved past awkwardness in the practical work of the construction weekends. The discomfort was in the formal structure itself, in the fact that this meeting was happening at all, which meant that someone with no official rank in the pack hierarchy was providing information that informed official patrol operations. The pack system was not accustomed to this arrangement. Some of the other patrol officers had opinions about it that they were not quite direct enough to express fully. Saren noticed this and did not make it easier or harder for them. She simply did the work. She showed up to the meetings and brought her data and spoke specifically and withdrew her opinions when they were not invited and offered them when they were. She did not try to manage how people felt about the arrangement. She let the arrangement demonstrate itself through its results. By March, the results were beginning to be visible. Border crossing incidents in the northern sector, the unauthorized or ambiguous crossings that required patrol response, had dropped by about 30% compared to the same period the previous year. The ancient wolves had appeared at the forest edge near the sanctuary 3 times since February. There had been no territorial incidents. These numbers went into the monthly report that Halric compiled for the Alpha King. They were reported neutrally, as data, without commentary. Kalen read the monthly reports with his morning coffee on the first of each month, and Halric watched him read them without watching him watch, which was an art he had spent 30 years developing. One morning in late March, Kalen set down the report and looked out the window of his office for a while. Then he said, "I am going to go look at the sanctuary." "All right," Halric said. "Not on official business, just to look." Of course. He went on a Thursday afternoon, alone. He walked the boundary of the 3 acres without going inside the fenced area. The low entry gate was closed, and he did not open it, which he thought later was the right instinct on his part. He stood at several points along the boundary and looked at the space from the outside. He looked at the monitoring structures and the water depression and the managed grass areas and the forest line beyond. He stood at the northeast corner for a while, the corner closest to where she had seen the large wolf in February. She was inside the sanctuary when he came. She saw him through the monitoring structure. She did not approach. She kept working. After about 20 minutes, he walked back toward the settlement. He did not tell her he had come. She did not mention that she had seen him. She thought that was the right arrangement. For now, the situation was saying what it needed to say through its own evidence. She did not need to add commentary. The fox was released in March, fully healed, on a morning when the first real spring warmth had come into the air. She opened the garden gate, and the fox stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the outside world with the particular expression of a creature in the process of reassembling its options. Then it walked out into the lane, paused once, looked back at her, and went. She stood in her garden doorway and watched it go. She thought about things that go when they are ready, and things that come back when they need to, and the fact that neither of those movements is in your control, and both of them are part of the same relationship. She went inside and poured tea, and opened the next unread journal, and kept reading. There was always more to understand. There was always more to know. Spring came to Ironvale in the way it always did, not all at once, but in a series of increasingly convincing installments, each one a little more persuasive than the last. The settlement's mood lifted with the temperature in the way that communities in cold northern places have always shifted with the season. An old biological contract between the human body and the length of the day. With the mood lifting, the stories that had been circulating about the sanctuary and the wolves and the previous autumn's standoff began to settle into a different kind of form. They stopped being stories that were told and started being part of the background understanding of what Ironvale was. A piece of the settlement's shared knowledge about itself, absorbed now into the ordinary texture of daily life. This was what happened, she had noticed, when things worked. Not a dramatic acknowledgement, not a celebration. Simply the gradual shift from something being new and requiring explanation to something being normal and requiring none. There were small signs of the shift everywhere, if you were watching for them. A new patrol officer in training, a young woman named Bess, 17 years old, applying for her first assignment, had requested the northern sector specifically. Her stated reason, in her application, was that she wanted to learn border management in the area where the new consultation protocol was in operation. This was the first time the protocol had been listed as a positive feature of an assignment by a new recruit. Halric told Saren this in passing, at a monthly coordination meeting, as if it were simply information. She received it as simply information. But she thought about it afterward, and she thought it was perhaps the clearest sign she had seen of the thing she had been hoping for. A generation coming up that would understand the northern border differently than the generation before them, because the information existed and the structures existed to convey it. That was what Alara had been working toward, not a conversion of the existing hierarchy. She had understood, with the clear eyes of someone who had watched the hierarchy operate for decades, that you could not change a structure by arguing with it. You changed it by making an alternative legible. You made it visible enough, and real enough, and successful enough, that people who came after could see it and choose to learn from it. She had not lived to see the alternative be legible, but she had done the work that made it possible for someone else to make it so. Saren thought about this often, not with sadness exactly, with something closer to gratitude, and the specific kind of peace that comes from understanding your place in a longer arc, understanding that you are not the beginning and not the end, but the current installment of something that started before you and will continue after. She thought, this is what it means to inherit something properly. Not to own it, to carry it forward. On a morning in April, she went to the cemetery at the settlement's southern edge, where Alara Ashfield was buried, under a plain stone with her name and dates and nothing else. The stone was mossy on one side. Saren did not clean it. Her grandmother had never been interested in surfaces. She stood at the grave for a while in the spring morning. She did not speak out loud. She thought about what she would say if she could, and what she decided she would say was, "The work is resuming. The documentation is nearly complete. The space is established. The wolves have come 3 times, and there have been no incidents. A young woman named Bess has requested the northern sector assignment because she wants to learn how the consultation works. You were right about the circumstance being required. You were right about the land." She stood for a while longer. A bird called somewhere in the cemetery trees, and the morning was cold but clear, and the shadow of the gravestone fell east in the early sun. Then she walked home, through the settlement that had known her grandmother, and had used her, and had not fully understood her, through the lanes, where people who had laughed at a public gathering 3 weeks before the wolves came, now nodded at her, with a different quality of recognition. She walked at her own pace, which was unhurried and direct, and she thought about the work that still remained, and the spring that was here, and the foxes, and the hedgehogs, and the ancient wolves, and the patience of things that do not require applause. She opened her gate. She went inside. She put the kettle on. Kalen Duskmore did not transform. That was the truth of it, and she thought the truth of it was more interesting than a transformation would have been. He was still the Alpha King. He was still the man who had moved through the market at 16, with the casual certainty of someone who had never questioned whether he belonged in a room. He still ran Ironvale with the particular combination of efficiency and authority that had characterized his tenure. His counsel still deferred to him in the way it always had, and he still made decisions in the way of someone accustomed to making decisions that other people were accustomed to accepting. But there were changes. Small ones, consistent ones, the kind that accumulate into something visible only when you have been paying close attention to the before. Halric noticed them. He was the primary person positioned to notice them, which was both his professional function and, in this specific case, the product of 30 years of close observation of a person he had worked alongside since that person was 19 years old. He made notes, because he always made notes. He did not analyze the notes publicly. He kept them the way he kept everything, in his field journals, in his small, precise handwriting, in the form of observations rather than conclusions. What the observations showed, across the 6 months following the night at the northern fence line, was this. Kalen paused longer before speaking in council meetings. Not dramatically, not in a way that registered as uncertainty, but the pause was there, and it was new. He had always been fast-moving in his decision-making, confident in the way of people who had learned early that their confidence would be rewarded. The pause suggested that he was, more often than before, holding a thought long enough to look at it from more than one side, before committing to it. He asked his council more questions. This was the change that the senior council members noticed most. because it changed the dynamic of the meetings in a way they felt without necessarily being able to name. He had always been willing to hear reports and recommendations, but there was a difference between hearing a report and asking questions that required the report giver to think harder about what they were saying, and he was doing more of the latter now. He asked Saren to the monthly coordination meetings twice, in addition to her regular consultation with Clara. Both times, he said little himself. He listened to what she and Clara had to say, asked 2 or 3 specific questions, and thanked them. It was not a performance of listening, it was actual listening, of the kind that changes the listener, rather than the kind that merely waits for the speaker to finish. His senior counsel was uncertain about how to understand these changes. The 2 members who were most invested in the existing structure, an alpha named Drum and a woman named Petra Ward, not the same Petra as the old woman who had told Halric about Ilara, but someone of similar age and less patience, watched the changes with the specific discomfort of people who were accustomed to knowing exactly how the person at the top of their structure thought, and now found that they needed to update their map. They did not resist openly. The events of the previous autumn had not left a lot of room for open resistance to the idea that the situation required a different approach. 47 witnesses was more than enough to make a counter-narrative expensive. Instead, they did what people in positions of institutional comfort usually do when the institution changes around them in ways they cannot control. They waited, and they made small expressions of their discomfort in private conversations that they assumed were private and that were not entirely, because Halric's skill at receiving information that had not been formally directed at him was one of the primary reasons he had held his position for as long as he had. He wrote their discomfort down. He kept it in the appropriate journal. He did not act on it yet. He thought it was information that would become relevant in time and was not yet fully formed. The larger change that he was most interested in was not Kalen's internal processes. It was the settlements. Communities do not shift quickly. They shift in the way of heavy objects, slowly at first, requiring significant force to set them moving, and then, once moving, difficult to stop. What Halric observed in Ironvale in the months after the sanctuary's establishment was the beginning of that movement. Not a revolution, not a restructuring, simply a very slow and very real redistribution of the kind of credibility that the settlement extended to different kinds of knowing. The clearest evidence was the next pack gathering after the wolves came. It was the first gathering of the following year, held in January, in the same central hall where Kalen had laughed at Saren's request 14 months before. The attendance was the same. The protocol was the same. The hierarchy was arranged in its familiar pattern. But when the request hour came, 8 people stepped forward. That was double the usual number. And of those 8, 3 were Omegas. 2 of them women who had attended gatherings for years without ever speaking in the request position, and one of them, a young man who had been in Ironvale for less than a year, and apparently had not been in the settlement long enough to learn how unlikely it was that his request would receive serious attention. All 3 Omega requests were heard fully. All 3 received responses that engaged with the actual content of what was being asked, rather than with the social position of the person asking. 1 was approved immediately. 1 was deferred for deliberation. 1 was declined, but declined with a specific explanation of why, and an invitation to bring a revised version to the following month's gathering. Halric watched this from his usual position near the front of the hall. He did not make notes during the gathering itself, because note-taking during the formal proceedings would be interpreted. He made his notes afterward, in the evening, in his office. The relevant entry began. The request hour today had 8 speakers, including 3 Omegas. The decline was handled with a specificity and respect that was absent from the handling of the Ashfield request 14 months ago. This is not explicitly noted or acknowledged by anyone in the room. It does not need to be. The shift is in the behavior, not the commentary on the behavior. Behavioral changes that become habitual become structural. We are watching the early stages of a structural change. He paused, and then added in the margin, in his small handwriting. The Ashfield request was the crack that the light came through. She was not a disruptor, she was a demonstration. He closed the journal and looked at the shelf of 23 of them. A 23rd had been added in the new year, and felt, in a way he usually kept carefully controlled, something close to satisfaction. This was what he had been doing his whole career, not managing the present, managing the conditions for a better future, quietly, with the tools available. within the constraints of a structure that he had never fully believed was the only possible version of itself. He thought that the structure was beginning, very slowly, to agree with him. Meanwhile, Saren's own life had changed in ways that were smaller and more daily than the pack-level shifts, and that mattered more to her. The work had expanded. The sanctuary consumed a significant portion of her time. The physical management of the space, the monitoring, the coordination meetings, the documentation project she was still working through. The compilation of Ilara's journals was a slow effort, requiring careful reading and selection, and the kind of organizational thinking that she did not find natural and had to impose deliberately. She worked on it in evenings, at the kitchen table, with the lamp and the tea that were the constants of her working life. The animal work had also expanded. More people in the settlement were bringing animals to her now, and not only injured ones. She had become, without announcing it, the person in Ironvale you went to when you wanted to understand something about an animal, rather than simply solve an immediate problem with one. Farmers came to her about animal behavior that was puzzling them. Families came about pets. The official pack veterinarian, a man named Roy Sander who had been in his role for 12 years, and was significantly more secure in his position than his predecessor had been, had sent her a careful message in February, suggesting that they formalize a referral arrangement, which she had agreed to after reviewing the terms he proposed and making 2 adjustments. It was not the life she had imagined at 20, which was a life she had never imagined, very specifically, because the future had always seemed to her less interesting to think about than the present. It was, rather, the life that had been building itself around her for years, constructed from the repeated application of what she knew toward what needed doing. She thought sometimes about how different it would look from the outside, to someone who had known her only as the Omega on the side of the hall at the monthly gathering. She thought it would be unrecognizable, which was one of the things about change that she found genuinely interesting. She thought also about how similar it was, from the inside, to the life she had always lived. The same cottage, the same garden, the same animals. The same journals, now augmented by her own. The same mornings along the forest edge, which she still walked before the settlement woke, because it was still the only hour she was entirely alone, and she still needed that hour, the way she needed the tea, and the lamp, and the particular smell of her kitchen. The difference was that now, when she walked in the forest edge in the early morning, the walking was part of something recorded, and acknowledged, and given a function, in the official structure of Ironvale. Ilara had done the same walk for 40 years without it being any of those things. She thought about that on a morning in late autumn, standing at the northern fence line in the dark, in the cold, watching the sanctuary's monitoring station light pulse in the distance. The forest was quiet. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, with the particular pale quality that arrived before dawn in the mountains. She thought, Ilara did this for 40 years without acknowledgement, and the work was still real. The acknowledgement does not make the work real. The work is what it is, acknowledged or not. She thought, but the acknowledgement matters for what comes next. She thought, both things are true, and they do not contradict each other. The sky lightened further. A bird started in the forest, the first of the morning, then another. She turned and walked back toward the settlement. She had a coordination meeting at 9, and a journal entry to finish, and a new patient to see at 10, a dog with a joint problem that Roy Sander had decided was outside his expertise. She had a full day of work, and she was glad of it. She walked back through the waking settlement, through the early morning smell of wood smoke and bread, through the lanes that knew her now in a different way than they had, past the market stalls that were just beginning to open, past old Marin's herb display where Marin was arranging bundles in the cold, who looked up and nodded with the particular nod of a person who has been waiting to see which way something landed for a long time, and is satisfied with where it landed. Saren nodded back. She opened her gate. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened the journal to the current page and picked up her pencil. There was always more to record. There was always more to know. She wrote the date at the top of the page and kept going. She was not, in the end, celebrated, not in any formal or deliberate way. The settlement did not throw her a gathering. The Pack Council did not vote her an honor. Kalen Duskmore did not stand in the central hall and say, in front of everyone, that he had been wrong. He had been wrong. She knew that, and she suspected he knew it, and she thought Halric knew it most precisely of all. But wrong was not a word that official structures had good language for, and she had never required the language. She had required the land and the formal role and the record in the documentation, and she had those things. The rest was private, and private was its own kind of complete. What she had instead of celebration was the slower and more durable kind of acknowledgement, the kind that takes the form of changed behavior rather than changed language. She had the nods in the lane, and the animals at her gate, and the young officer requesting the Northern Sector assignment, and the 3 Omegas in the request hour at the January gathering, and the coordination meetings that ran on a formal schedule and generated formal records. She had the documentation project, which was nearly complete now, and which would go into the PAC's permanent administrative archive at the end of the spring. Ilara's 40 years of field observation, followed by Saren's 11 years of observation since, followed by the past year of formal coordination records. A record of 153 pages that described, in specific and demonstrable terms, the nature of the relationship between Iron Vale and the deep forest's ancient inhabitants, and what it required to maintain. She had ordered a second shelf for the kitchen, because the original one was bending. And she had, on a cold evening in November, a year and a half after the wolves came, a visit she had not expected. She was in the garden, checking on the hedgehog that had been wintering under the brush pile near the fence for the past 3 weeks, when she heard the gate. She came around the side of the cottage and found Bess Carver, the young patrol officer who had requested the Northern Sector assignment, standing at the gate with a notebook in her hand, and the expression of someone who has been working up to something for a while. "I was wondering," Bess said, "if you would be willing to teach me some things." Saren looked at her for a moment. Bess was 19, with the clear, steady eyes of someone who paid attention, and the specific combination of practicality and patience that suggested the work would suit her. She had been on the Northern Sector for 4 months. She had attended every coordination meeting and said very little but written everything down. "What things?" Saren said. Bess opened her notebook. She had a list. It was a specific list, organized by category, which told Saren something useful about how Bess approached problems. It covered animal behavior patterns, the interpretation of observation data, the management of the monitoring structure, and, at the bottom, listed last but underlined, understanding what the ancient wolves are communicating and how to communicate back. Saren read the list. Then she looked at Bess. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." Bess came in. She sat at the kitchen table in the chair that was across from Saren's usual one, and put her notebook on the table, and looked around the kitchen with the alert observational attention of someone who is filing everything away for future reference. She looked at the shelf of journals. She looked at the work table, where there was currently a young crow with a wing problem who had arrived 3 days ago. She looked at the north-facing window. "Your grandmother kept all these records?" she said. "Most of them," Saren said. "The ones in the new section are mine." "How long did it take her to learn what she knew?" Saren thought about this. "Her whole life," she said, "which sounds like a long time from where you are standing now, but it does not feel like a long time from the inside. From the inside it feels like each thing you learn makes the next thing more possible." Bess considered this. She wrote something in her notebook. "Is there a place to start?" she said. "Yes," Saren said. She set 2 cups of tea on the table and sat down across from her. "Start with the observation. Just the observation, without the interpretation. Watch something for long enough that you stop trying to make it mean what you expect it to mean and start letting it tell you what it actually means. Everything else comes from that." Bess was writing. "That is where my grandmother started," Saren said. "That is where I started. It is the same place every time." She picked up her tea. Outside, the November evening was settling over the garden, over the hedgehog under the brush pile, over the sanctuary and the monitoring stations and the ancient forest beyond. The crow on the work table turned its head and regarded the room with one bright eye. Bess kept writing. The lamp burned. The work went on. There is a drawer in Saren Ashfield's kitchen table that she rarely opens when anyone else is present. Not because it is locked, and not because it contains anything she would refuse to show a person she trusted, simply because it is the private heart of the cottage's history, and the private heart of anything deserves the right to be visited alone. Inside the drawer, in order of age, are 14 field journals belonging to her grandmother, Ilara Ashfield. They cover a period from the year Ilara turned 25 to the year she died. 43 years of observation compressed into handwriting so careful and so dense that there are entries which take a full hour to read properly. Not because the language is difficult, but because the content requires slowing down to fully absorb. Below the journals is the land grant document, folded once, in the state it arrived in the year before last. And below the land grant, in a wooden box that her grandmother had made at some point in her middle age from timber, salvaged from the old pine that fell in the north wind, the winter Saren was 8, is a single piece of paper, covered in the oldest handwriting Saren has ever seen, older than Alara's, older than anyone living in Ironvale could have produced. She does not know whose handwriting it is, or how old it is, or exactly how it came to be in her grandmother's possession, because Alara died with some things still unspoken. What she knows is that the text on the paper, though she has read it more times than she can count, still gives her the same feeling each time, which is the feeling of a thing that is true in the way that deep things are true, not because they have been proven, but because they do not require proof, because they are felt in the same place that all the oldest knowledge is felt. The text says, "There are those in every generation who carry the older voice. They are not loud, they do not claim. They simply know what is in the air, because they have learned to stop filling the air with themselves. The world that cannot be managed will always find them, eventually, and when it does, it will not ask permission. It will simply arrive and wait to be heard." She found this paper in the 3rd year after Alara's death, when she was organizing the older journals, and found the box inside the drawer that she had not previously noticed. She sat in this kitchen for a long time after reading it. Then she put it back in the box, and she has opened the box perhaps once a year since, not to remind herself of the content. She knows the content, but because reading it is a kind of maintenance, the way checking a monitoring station is a kind of maintenance. It keeps a connection active. 2 winters have passed since the night the ancient wolves came to the settlement's northern edge. The sanctuary is in its 2nd full year of operation. The physical space has found its rhythm, which is to say that it no longer requires the same intensity of active management that the early months required, because the plants and the animals and the seasonal patterns have all settled into the shape they are going to hold. This is what happens with a properly established space. It develops its own momentum. Your job shifts from construction to maintenance, from shaping to attending. The monitoring records are consistent and detailed. There have been 6 appearances by the ancient wolves at the forest edge since the night they came to the clearing, all of them brief, all of them at the boundary of the sanctuary rather than inside it, all of them characterized by the same quality of attended patience that Saren has learned to recognize as the specific posture of something that is checking in, rather than arriving with urgency. The large one came once alone, in the first winter, and stood at the northeast tree line for about 20 minutes, on a morning when Saren was doing her regular observation walk. It looked at her across the width of the sanctuary. She looked back. Neither of them moved. After about 20 minutes, it turned and walked back into the forest, with the unhurried certainty of something that had satisfied a purpose and was moving on to the next thing. She wrote the observation in her journal that afternoon. 43 words, in the same small controlled handwriting she had absorbed without being taught it. She looked at the entry after she finished it and thought that her grandmother would have written the same observation in about the same number of words, and that this seemed right. Bess Carver has been coming to the cottage on Tuesday evenings for 8 months. She is a good student in the specific sense that matters most, which is not that she understands things quickly, but that she is patient with things she does not understand yet, and does not fill the space of not knowing with premature conclusions. She makes careful observations. She asks specific questions. She is beginning to notice things in the field that she could not have noticed 6 months ago, not because her eyes have changed, but because the categories in her brain have, and categories determine what the eyes register as significant. She and Clara Briggs have developed, over the past year of working the northern sector together, the kind of working relationship that is built on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than on friendship, which is durable, in a way that friendships sometimes are not when the work gets difficult. They disagree sometimes, in the coordination meetings, about specific management decisions. The disagreements are productive because both of them are more interested in getting the answer right than in being the one who was right. This is the thing that Saren finds most interesting to watch, not the big structural changes, which she had expected in some form once the situation was established, but the smaller and more personal changes in the people doing the daily work. The way Bess looks at the forest now, compared to how she looked at it 8 months ago, The way Clara's reports have become more nuanced, less reliant on the categorizing language of standard patrol documentation, and more specific about what she actually observed. The way Roy Sander, the pack veterinarian, has started citing the coordination records in his own case notes, quietly, without making a point of it, in the way of someone incorporating new information into their existing practice. These are the changes that last, not the dramatic moments, which people remember, and then gradually stop thinking about as they recede into the past. The habits, and the practices, and the way people who do the work daily begin to see differently. These are what actually changes the world, and they change it slowly, and she is comfortable with slowly. She thinks about her grandmother. Ilara Ashfield worked for 40 years in this same cottage, in this same kitchen, with the same view of the north-facing window, and the same smell in the air, and the same patience about things that required patience. She was used by the settlement and not celebrated by it, which she apparently accepted as the terms of a situation she had not chosen, but had decided to make her best use of. She built a relationship with the oldest and most powerful presences in the surrounding forest, by showing up, consistently, for decades, without requiring acknowledgement or reward. She documented everything in small, careful handwriting that she apparently intended to be read, because you do not document things that carefully if you do not intend for them to be read. She had a granddaughter who watched her do all of this from the time that granddaughter was old enough to watch anything, and she trusted, in the way of someone who understood that things built correctly outlast the person who builds them, that the granddaughter would be ready when the moment arrived. Saren has thought a great deal about what it means to be trusted with something by someone who is no longer present to confirm or adjust the trust. She has thought about it the way she thinks about most things, not in the abstract, but in the daily and practical form of continuing to do the work. Each journal entry she makes is an answer to that trust. Each coordination meeting, each evening with Bess at the kitchen table, each walk along the forest edge in the dark before the settlement wakes. These are the form the answer takes. It is not a dramatic answer. She is not a dramatic person. She has no need, and has never had any need, for the kind of recognition that arranges itself into a story with a clear and satisfying ending. What she has is work that matters, and land that is in use, and records that will outlast her, and a young woman sitting across her kitchen table on Tuesday evenings writing things down. She thinks that is the shape of a life that is doing what it is supposed to do. On a cold evening in the second winter since the wolves came, she sits at the border of the sanctuary with a lamp and her current observation journal. The sky is clear, which is unusual for the deep of winter in the mountains, and the stars above the forest are very bright and very close. The settlement's lights are warm behind her, and the forest ahead is dark in the way that the deep forest is always dark, which is not like the darkness of a room with the lights off, but like the darkness of something that has its own interior life, and does not need external light to see by. 3 of the ancient wolves are with her. Not in the sanctuary, at the tree line, which is where they are most of the time, which is the appropriate distance for the relationship at its current stage. They arrived about 20 minutes ago, which she noted in her journal, and they have been there since, which she will note when they leave. The large one is lying down, the other 2 are sitting. All 3 of them are facing in her direction, with the attended quality of creatures that are not waiting for anything in particular, but are simply, in some fundamental sense, present. She is writing in the journal by lamplight. The entry is routine, covering the day's observations: morning walk, sanctuary check, Eastern Depression water level, monitoring station status, evening arrival of the 3 wolves. She writes in the same small controlled handwriting, at the same pace, with the same absence of drama that she brings to all the entries. This is not a significant evening by any measure. Nothing unusual is happening. She is simply here. The wolves are simply there. The lamp is burning. The journal is being written. The work is being done. This is what it looks like, from the inside, when a thing is working correctly. Not a moment of victory, not a dramatic turn, simply the ongoing reality of a relationship maintained through patience and presence, and the regular practice of paying attention. She looks up from the journal for a moment. The large wolf is watching her. It has been watching her, in various forms of this same encounter, for 2 years now, and she has been watching it, and what they have built between them in that watching is something she does not have the language to fully describe, which is fine. Not everything requires description. She looks at it for a moment. Then she looks back at the journal and keeps writing. The settlement is behind her. The forest is ahead. She is in the space between them. which is the space her grandmother maintained for 40 years before her, and which she intends to maintain for as long as she is able, and which Bess will eventually know well enough to take forward from there. The lamp burns. The wolves wait. The work goes on. This is how it ends, and how it continues, which are, when you understand it correctly, the same thing. She was not the lonely Omega the settlement had always seen. She had never been. She had been something older and quieter and more patient than that, growing into the fullness of what she was, at the pace that things grown in deep soil always take. She had been, from the beginning, the one the forest was waiting for. And now the forest knew she was here. And she was here. And the work was very far from finished. She turned the page. She kept writing. Halric Owen published his administrative report on the sanctuary in the spring, covering the first full year of its operation. The report was formal and precise, in the way of all his documents, built from data and structured around measurable outcomes. It covered the reduction in northern border incidents, the improvement in patrol team observation quality, the formal consultation protocol, and its effect on decision-making, the documentation project and its completion. The report also contained, in its final 2 paragraphs, something that was unusual for a PAC administration document, which was a brief observation that was not statistical. He had not planned to include it. He had written it in draft, reading through the report on a late evening in March, and then he had sat with his hand on the paragraph for a while, deciding whether to leave it in. He left it in. He thought it needed to be said, and he thought that he was perhaps the only person in a position formal enough to say it, without it being dismissed as sentiment. The paragraph said, "The events of the past 18 months reflect what becomes possible when knowledge that exists outside the official structure of a community is made visible rather than dismissed. The sanctuary's success is not the result of new information being generated. The information existed in complete form for 40 years prior to its formal acknowledgement. What changed was not the information but the community's willingness to receive it. This report recommends that the current consultation and documentation protocols be maintained and extended, and that the administrative record acknowledge the foundational contribution of both Ilara Ashfield and Saren Ashfield to what this community understands about its relationship with the forest it lives beside." He paused, and then added, "Their work was real before it was recognized. Its recognition does not create its value, but the record should state the value clearly, for those who come after." Kalen read the report on a Saturday morning. He read it twice, which he only did with reports that required something from him beyond administration. Then he signed the approval form and sent it to the archive, and went for a long walk along the settlement's outer boundary, which he sometimes did when he was thinking about something. He walked the whole perimeter. It took about 2 hours. When he reached the northern section, he stopped and looked at the sanctuary through the fence for a while. The monitoring station lights were on, even in the daylight, a small, steady pulse that meant the system was running. The grass was beginning to green in the early spring. The forest beyond was still winter dark, the pine canopy heavy with the last of the cold. He stood there for about 10 minutes. Then he continued his walk. He did not stop at her cottage. He thought about it, for a moment, at the fork in the path where the lane that led to her gate branched off from the outer boundary road. He stood at the fork for a few seconds. Then he went on. There was not much he needed to say that was not already in the record, and she was not someone who required things to be said. She was someone who read situations clearly and understood what was acknowledged, without requiring the acknowledgement to take a specific verbal form. What he could do, what he had already been doing, and would continue to do, was the part that mattered in practice. He could run the pack in a way that made room for what she knew. He could maintain the protocols that Halric had drafted and she had reviewed. He could make sure that Bess Carver, when she was ready to take on a more senior role, had the kind of support that allowed her to take it without having to fight for it the way Saren had fought. He was not the man he had been at the pack gathering 14 months ago, and he knew this, and he thought it was a reasonable thing to know about yourself, without requiring it to be a more dramatic realization than it was. You learn. You change what you do. The doing is what matters. He walked the rest of the perimeter and went back to his office. He had a council meeting at noon. He had a border report to review. He had the spring planning cycle to begin. He had a settlement to run. He sat at his desk and opened the first file. Across the settlement, in the cottage at the northern edge, Saren Ashfield was at her kitchen table with tea and a journal she had not opened yet. She was looking at the north-facing window, which showed the pale blue of a spring morning, and, above the sanctuary fence line, the dark edge of the deep forest. The crow with the wing problem had been released the week before, joining the fox and the lamb and the many dozens of animals before them who had come through this kitchen and left when they were ready. The work table was empty for the moment, which did not happen often. She sat with the quiet of it. She thought about what her grandmother had written, decades ago, in the journal that now sat in the administrative archive alongside 11 years of her own records. I am not doing something extraordinary. I am doing something necessary. The fact that it is not recognized does not change its nature. What it is, it is. She opened the journal. She wrote the date at the top of the page. She began to record what the morning had shown her. Outside, in the sanctuary, a family of field mice was investigating the new spring growth near the eastern water depression. 3 deer had been at the forest edge at dawn. The monitoring station had recorded movement in the northeast sector at 2 in the morning, which was a time when the ancient wolves sometimes passed through the boundary area on routes she was still mapping. The work was ordinary. The work was specific. The work was real. She kept writing. The lamp burned on beside her even in the daylight, because she liked it, and because her grandmother had liked it, and because some things are carried forward, not because they are practical, but because they are true. The story that people told in Ironvale, the one that had become part of the settlement's memory of itself, the one that would eventually be told to children who had not yet been born, was the story of the night the ancient wolves came and the Alpha King's teams could not move them. The story of a woman who walked out alone into the dark grass and spoke in a quiet voice and sent them home. That was the story as it would be told. But the story, as it actually was longer and quieter than that. It was the story of 2 women, one who had spent 40 years building a relationship that no one could see the importance of, and one who had spent her life learning from the evidence of that relationship without being taught it formally, and who had been ready when the moment came, because she had been preparing her whole life for a moment she did not know was coming. It was the story of patience, which is not passive but active, the continuous active practice of attending to something long enough, and honestly enough, that it eventually shows you what it is. It was the story of the forest, which has always been waiting for the ones who know how to listen, and always will be, in every generation, for as long as the forest is there. Saren wrote for another hour. Then she capped her pen, and closed the journal, and stood up, and stretched, and went out to her garden, where the spring had been slowly arriving for the past 2 weeks, and where the hedgehog family from the brush pile had begun to appear in the evenings. She stood in the garden in the pale spring morning and looked at the north wall of her cottage, above which the sky was blue and clear, and the light was coming in from the east, in a way that was soft and very sharp at the same time, the way spring light in the mountains always was, arriving with the sudden certainty of something that has been on its way for a long time and has finally arrived. She stood in it for a while. Then she went inside and made another cup of tea and sat back down at the table, because the work did not finish, and she did not want it to, and there was still a great deal left to understand, and she had time, and she had the journals, and she had the forest to the north and the sanctuary she had built and the young woman who came on Tuesday evenings to learn, and all of it was enough. All of it was more than enough. It was everything.